We tend to assume that the idea of a person being neither simply a man nor simply a woman is a brand new one, a product of our particular moment, of modern language, of recent debates, of the world we happen to live in now, something that surely the ancient world had never even imagined, and whatever you make of any of today's conversations. And I'm not here to wade into those. The deep history tells a genuinely different story, one that almost nobody expects. Because the idea of a person who lived outside the clean line between man and woman is not new. It is ancient. It turns up across continents, across cultures, across thousands of years in societies that had no contact with one another whatsoever, and that arrived at it entirely on their own. And in a great many of those societies, such a person wasn't hidden or erased or treated as something impossible. They were recognized. They were given a place, and sometimes remarkably, a place of real honor. So that is the question for today, and it is a fascinating one. What did ancient humans actually do with a person who felt like neither man nor woman? How far back does this go, and how did our ancestors come to understand it? I'm going to answer this the way we answer everything on this channel, with the evidence honestly, carefully, and with respect. So stick with me, because the real history here is older and far richer than the assumption it overturns. Let's begin with the single most important fact, the one that reframes everything else. And it is this: the recognition of people beyond just man and woman is not rare in the human record. It is astonishingly widespread. When anthropologists and historians went looking, they didn't find one or two unusual societies that made room for such people. They found them all over the world, on nearly every inhabited continent, among people separated by oceans, by deserts, by tens of thousands of years of separate history, with no possible contact between them. Across the indigenous nations of North America, many, though importantly, not all, had long recognized roles for people who lived in some way between or beyond man and woman. I want to be careful and precise here, because this is often flattened, and it deserves better. Today you'll often hear the umbrella term two-spirit used for these roles, but that term is actually modern. It was created by indigenous people themselves only a few decades ago, as a respectful unifying word in their own language's place. Each individual nation had its own specific term, its own specific understanding, its own specific role, and these differed enormously from one people to the next. There was never one single idea here. There were many dozens of distinct cultural understandings, each rooted in its own people's particular world. To take all of those rich separate traditions and flatten them into one word risks erasing exactly the diversity that makes them so remarkable. So when I speak of them together, please hear it as a kind of shorthand for a vast and varied human reality, not as the claim that they were ever all the same thing. And it reaches far beyond the Americas. In South Asia, there are traditions of a recognized third category of person that go back thousands of years, referenced in some of the oldest texts of the region. Communities that have held a distinct, named social, and sometimes ceremonial place for an immense span of time across the islands of the Pacific. A number of societies have long recognized people who move between or beyond the usual roles, woven openly into ordinary community life. In parts of Siberia, in parts of Africa, in scattered societies around the globe, anthropologists have documented the same basic thing again and again. A culture that looked at the simple division of man and woman, recognized that some of its people didn't fit it, and built a way to understand and include them. And these weren't fragile, marginal arrangements at the edges of these societies. In many cases, they were woven right into the culture's understanding of the world, its stories, its ceremonies, its sense of how human life was supposed to work. Some cultures told origin stories in which beings beyond the simple two were there from the very beginning, part of the natural order of creation. Some had specific words that were neither an insult nor a whisper, but ordinary vocabulary, as everyday as the words for elder or cousin. When a category of person has its own respected name in a language, its own place in the culture's myths, its own recognized role in community life, that is not a society reluctantly tolerating an exception. That is a society that genuinely sees such people as a real and expected part of the human world. I do want to add one careful note, because precision matters and these histories deserve it. It would be a mistake to collapse all of these varied traditions into a single thing or to map them too neatly onto any modern idea. Each of these cultures understood gender in its own way, shaped by its own world, and their categories don't line up perfectly with one another or with our contemporary terms. What they share is not one identical concept, but a common move, the recognition that human beings come in more than two kinds, and the building of a place for that. The specifics were beautifully, irreducibly diverse. Now, sit with what that pattern means, because it is the heart of the whole matter. When you find a single culture doing something unusual, you can reasonably guess that culture invented it. But when you find societies all over the world independently with no contact across the entire span of human history, arriving at the very same recognition, that is almost never something a single culture dreamed up and spread. That is almost always a sign of something deeper, something that comes not from any one society, but from the underlying reality of human beings themselves, something each culture encountered on its own, and then found its own way to name and make sense of. This is actually how anthropologists reason about human nature in general. When a trait or a practice shows up in just a few places, it might be a local quirk, an accident of one culture's history, but when something appears again and again all across the world in peoples who never touched, that independent repetition is a powerful clue. It is the same reason we're confident that things like music or storytelling or grief rituals or the incest taboo aren't the invention of any one culture. They're everywhere, so they must come from something in us, not from something one society happened to think up. The recognition of people beyond the gender binary belongs on that list. Its sheer global recurrence in cultures with nothing else in common is exactly the fingerprint of a deep and universal human reality rather than a passing idea. In other words, the fact that this appears everywhere is itself the evidence. It tells us that people who feel like neither man nor woman are not a product of any particular time or place or culture. They have, in all likelihood, always been part of human populations everywhere, throughout our history. What changed from culture to culture was never whether such people existed. It was only how each society chose to respond to them. And that response is where the human story gets genuinely interesting. So what did they actually do? How did ancient societies treat such a person? The honest answer is that it varied enormously. And I won't pretend it was always gentle, because that wouldn't be true. But across a striking number of societies, the response was not fear or erasure. It was a place. At the simplest level, in many cultures, such a person was simply accepted as one of the recognized kinds of person their world contained. They had a role they could step into, a way of living that their community understood. They might take on the work, the dress, the social position usually associated with the other gender, or a blend, or something entirely their own. And this was not scandalous or shocking. It was just one of the known ways a human life could go. There was a slot for them in the social order, and they filled it. And life went on. For a person who didn't fit the simple two, being born into such a society meant being born into a world that already had a place ready for them. And think about what an extraordinary gift that is, to be born into a world that already understands you. We sometimes imagine that to be different in the ancient world must have meant a life of isolation. But for a person in one of these societies, the opposite was often true. There was no agonized question of what they were, because the answer already existed in their culture, waiting for them. There was a name for it. There were others who had walked that path before. There was a recognized way to live it. Their difference did not cast them out of the human community. It simply placed them at a particular understood spot within it. In a real sense, they were spared a loneliness that some people in more rigid societies have had to endure, the loneliness of being something your own culture has no words for. But it often went further than mere acceptance. And this is the part that genuinely surprises people. In many societies, a person who stood between or beyond man and woman was seen not as lacking something, but as having something, as gifted, even as sacred. Think about the logic of it, because there is a profound logic here. In a world that divided so much of life into the realm of men and the realm of women, a person who belonged fully to neither was someone who could move between both. They could understand both worlds, speak to both, bridge them. And a being who could stand between two worlds was, in the thinking of many cultures, naturally suited to stand between other kinds of worlds too, between the living and the dead, the human and the divine, the everyday and the sacred. And so, in society after society, people who lived beyond the gender line were drawn toward exactly these roles: healers, ceremonial leaders, keepers of ritual, mediators, people believed to have a special relationship with the spirit world. The very thing that made them different was understood as the source of a particular power, and it makes a deep kind of sense once you step into that worldview. Many ancient cultures saw spiritual power as flowing precisely from the crossing of boundaries, from standing in the place where ordinary categories break down. A person who already lived in that in-between place, naturally every day, was seen as someone who lived closer to the sacred than most, someone for whom the membrane between worlds was simply thinner. In some societies, such people were the ones called upon to name a child, to bless a marriage, to mourn the dead, to mediate a bitter dispute, precisely because they were understood to stand a little outside the ordinary divisions that everyone else was bound by. Their in-betweenness wasn't a deficit to be pitied. It was treated as a vantage point, a kind of sight the rest of the community didn't have. There is something else worth noticing, too. A person who could understand both the world of men and the world of women had a real and practical social value in daily life, quite apart from anything spiritual. They could move and work and speak in places others couldn't. They could mediate between groups that were otherwise kept apart. They could carry knowledge, skills, and understanding across a divide that structured much of their society. In a community where so much was split between men's spheres and women's spheres, a person who belonged to both, or to neither, could be a uniquely valuable connector. And that value was not lost on the people around them. That is a staggering reversal of the assumption we started with. We imagine the ancient world greeting such a person with confusion or cruelty. But in a great many places, the truth was closer to the opposite. The person who was neither man nor woman wasn't a problem the society had to solve. They were, sometimes among the most respected people in it, sought out, relied upon, honored for the very in-betweenness we might have assumed would make them outcasts. And there is a practical wisdom in this too. Beyond the spiritual, a community is stronger when it has room for all of its people, when it can take whatever each person is and find a way for that to be valuable. A society that could look at someone who didn't fit its categories and respond not by casting them out, but by making a place for them was a society that wasted no one. We've seen this pattern again and again on this channel, that human survival ran on inclusion, on the ability to weave every kind of person into the fabric of the group. The recognition of those beyond the gender line is part of that same deep human genius for finding a place for everyone. Now, I have to be honest about the other side, because the historical record demands it. This was never universal, and it was never always kind. Some societies were harsh toward people who didn't fit. Acceptance in one culture could sit beside cruelty in another. And there is a painful historical pattern worth naming. In many parts of the world, traditions that had long made room for such people were actively destroyed, often by outside forces, by colonizers and conquerors who imposed their own rigid categories and violently erased the older, more flexible understandings they found. A great deal of the acceptance that once existed was not outgrown. It was stamped out, so the full picture holds both things at once, a deep, ancient, worldwide human tendency to recognize and often honor those beyond the gender line, and a long history in places of that recognition being attacked and lost. This last point is important, and it is often misunderstood. So let me be clear about it. When people encounter, say, an indigenous American nation that once had a respected role for those beyond the gender line and learn that the same nation later seemed far more rigid, they sometimes conclude that the acceptance must have been the new, imported idea. The history usually runs the other way. In case after case, it was the rigid two-category system that was imposed from outside, brought by colonizers, enforced by missionaries and administrators who could not tolerate what they found, and pressed onto peoples who had understood these things differently for countless generations. The older, more inclusive understanding was the native one. The narrowing came later, and often by force. So when we picture the deep past as rigid and our own time as the first to allow for any flexibility, we have the timeline almost exactly upside down. Much of the rigidity is the recent layer. The recognition is the ancient bedrock beneath it. None of this is to romanticize the past or to pretend every ancient society was a haven. They weren't, and the experiences of these individuals surely range from deep belonging to real suffering, exactly as human experiences always do. But the overall shape of the evidence is clear and worth sitting with honestly across the great sweep of human history and human cultures making a place for people. Beyond the simple two was not the exception waiting to be invented. It was, remarkably often, the rule. But here is what nobody tells you. Here is the thing that deep history makes unavoidable. For as long as there have been human beings, there have been people who felt like neither simply a man nor simply a woman. They are not a recent appearance, not a modern idea, not a product of these particular times. They have been present in human groups across the entire span of our existence, in every era, on every continent, in your own deep ancestry somewhere down the line. The only thing that has ever changed is how the people around them chose to respond. And the deep record shows that, Again and again, across the whole world, human societies responded not with bewilderment, but with recognition, finding words for such people, finding roles for them, and often finding in them something valuable, even sacred. So the modern assumption gets the story exactly backwards. The idea that a person might be neither man nor woman isn't a new thing. What is new, historically speaking, is the insistence that everyone must fit neatly into one of only two boxes, with nothing in between. That rigidity is in many places the more recent arrival. The older, deeper, more widespread human story is the one that had room, that looked at the full range of people its communities actually contained, and made a place for all of them. So let's go back one last time to that person in an ancient group thousands of years ago. The one who didn't fit the role their body seemed to assign them, who wasn't simply a man or simply a woman, but something else, something in between or beyond. What did ancient humans do with them? In a great many times and places, they did something we might not have expected and might learn from. They didn't turn away. They didn't pretend such a person couldn't exist. They looked at them clearly, gave them a name in their own tongue, opened a place for them in the order of things, and sometimes they looked at the one who walked between worlds and saw not a stranger to be feared, but someone touched with a gift. They were part of the human story fully all the way down. They always have been, and the long record of how often they were welcomed is something worth remembering. So here is my question for you, and I really do want to know, does it change anything to learn that this is not a new chapter in the human story, but one of its oldest and most widespread that, across the whole world, for thousands of years, our ancestors so often found a place and even honor for the people who lived beyond the line? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and the way people reflect honestly on questions like this is always the most human part of all. Until then, take care of yourselves and of each other.